in your evidence, you set out a number of significant challenges for St Michael's House. So in relation to the number of individuals in residential settings, you said there were, I think it was 450. And you said that in the coming years you're expecting an increase of 137%. I think if I heard that correctly. Now, I don't know over what time period that 137% increase is expected to be, but on my past Leaving Cert maths from the early 80s, that suggests to me there could be as many as 900 people in total. And you already have 80 people on urgent waiting lists. So in relation to that forecast for the coming years, can you quantify it for me? Like in 5 years' time, would you expect that there would be another 450 plus people requiring urgent accommodation on top of the 84 you already have waiting? And so basically, what is that forecast, and what do you think is your capacity to meet that? Is there a funding programme that you have sought that is, matched to that predicted forecast? And in relation to facilities and accommodation, how many facilities and accommodation centres are planned to be built in the next 5 years? Like, for example, you have 170 ageing carers, and I could be wrong, but I imagine that matches somehow onto the 84 people who require urgent. So that's a lot of people to accommodate with ageing parents. And I know from having lost my own parents, events can move very quickly. People, especially when they're caring for an adult child with complex needs, people die all the time. So I imagine that's, when you say it's urgent, like what's being built, and does it match that requirement plus the predicted, as you say, 137% increase? And I suspect also, just in relation to that predicted increase, like our population has increased by over 1 million since 2004, and that population expansion is going to increase. We're getting new citizens from all over the world who have complex needs, and I've a huge volume of correspondence from people who have no resources whatsoever in that regard, many of whom are actually homeless. In relation then to the capital programme, you touched briefly on recruitment and retention. Realistically, is there a HR recruitment programme, a realistic one in place to upscale and recruit the correct number of staff to deal with that massive increase in the population that requires support and services? The fifth question then is, is this something that the committee can help you with? I mean, is there a requirement for government to step up and exponentially increase the investment in, you're asked by the state to provide these services, and kind of reading between the lines in your presentation, I kind of sense that you don't have sufficient investment or resources to meet that. So is there a number or a headline figure that you would put out there to say that in an ideal world, this is how much we'd need on an annual basis to adequately resource and support these families? Respite. I receive a lot of correspondence, and it's been reported in the mainstream press recently. Respite is something that isn't readily available to families. Now, my own situation is different from that your service is oriented towards. But like, I've never had respite in 20 years, never. Not one day, not 1 hour, nothing. So how do you plan to expand the respite that's available? And then, so I only have 3 more questions. I'm sorry about the volume of questions. And in these questions, might I say, there's no implied criticism of anybody in the room here. So transport is an issue that comes up over and over again. I have a nephew with Down syndrome who's in South County Dublin, and he has no transport to his day service. And as a consequence, he doesn't have a day service. Because, we're all forced to work. The idea that there's somebody at home that can bring somebody to a day service. And in fact, in his case, the day service would involve a daily to and from commute of 3 hours. So if they don't have, if service users don't have transport, then they don't have a service. And if we're talking about a rights-based approach, then transport has to be provided. And I've letters here, and I had a guest who couldn't attend, who's just there's no transport for their child. Now, you mentioned in your speech on page 3, for children and young persons, in addition to Article 7 of UNCRPD, our policy and approach to the delivery of services to children and young people is governed by the PDS policy services of the HSE. Now, the HSE have been in here in front of this committee and they've said on the record that PDS has failed. It's in failure. So therefore, you can't have a policy that's predicated on something that has failed. Like we've had this on the record from the CEO of the HSE. Oh yeah, that's failed. It's in failure. We've also had evidence presented to the committee here from researchers in recent weeks that shows that there's no evidence base for PDS. It was never signed off by a clinician. It was never risk assessed, and it is having incredibly negative outcomes for children and adults all across the state. And who's accountable for that, I don't know. But in that context, I have a question for you, and it's a difficult question to ask. But you're saying that you have school leavers that are being failed, 1 from 2020, 3 from 2023, 4 from 2024, 84 on the list without an appropriate day service. Residential priority list, 84 again. Respite wait list, 50 adults, 27 children. Transport wait list, 45. I mean, for you trying to provide this service in absolute good faith, and I absolutely, trust in your complete integrity and your utmost good faith, would you describe that? If the HSE tell us that PDS is a failure, would you describe the situation that confronts you as worst case scenario? Are you also failing? Are you in crisis? Are you in acute crisis? Is there a requirement for an intervention, or do you think everything is as you would expect in any other jurisdiction? Or are we outliers in that regard? And then finally, what happens when these elderly parents die? What happens to those adults with complex needs? Where do they end up? Are they involuntarily detained under the Mental Health Act? Do they end up in the ED? Are they placed in nursing homes? Where do they go? What happens to them? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So there's a number of issues. If I may, I'm going to, at the end, if I pass you to Dermot in relation to the premises and to Tara in relation to transport. But in relation to the 137%, that was a reference to the CSO who said between 2018 and 2028, the age group between 18 and 29 years of age would grow by that amount. For us, in terms of the wait list, the forecast would be in and around, and there's no way of knowing for sure, but in and around 130, 100 to 150. But that would be referrals. At the moment, it would be subject to vacancies arising in our residential services. What we see more and more is that the need does not always match the vacancy. And obviously, when there are people in a designated centre in a house that's regulated by HICWA, the days, thankfully, of just, admitting somebody into a bed are gone. There's consultation with the individuals who live in that house. There's choice. If there's a vacancy, it's typically because somebody has died, so the people in that house need time, like the rest of us, to, process that and that bereavement. So premises and appropriate premises and premises that meet very complex needs at times is a huge challenge, and I'll let Dermot talk to that in a minute. In relation to the funding programme, it is reactive. Sorry.
Just to confirm then, so between 130 and 150 between now and 2028, that's extra on top of the 84 you have on your waiting list. So that's about, in total then, 230.
Yes.
And do you have the capacity to meet those needs?
No.
So how would you characterise that? Would you characterise that as failure in slow motion? Like, are you going to fail?
I would characterise that we are not unable to meet the current level and future level of demand. I would say that that's something that we have highlighted on many an occasion. I would say that we need not only a responsive funding model to meet those emergency placements and planned places, but we need appropriate accommodation. So if individuals are in their 70s caring for adult children, one can assume adult children, many cases those individuals are in their 40s or 50s. So there can be unique needs in terms of a residential place. It might be ground floor, it might be wheelchair accessible, it might be that there's behaviours that individual can only live with perhaps one other person. There's it's so individualised, it's very. So what I can say to you is that we are operating with a huge demand, a huge expectation, and we are struggling to meet current demand. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yeah. And like, I'm sorry to push this point. Like,
yeah.
Who do you appeal to for this? I mean, is it the HSE that you're beholden to, or is it the Department of Public Enterprise and Reform? Is it the Minister for Finance? Like, where's the kind of the blockage on getting the adequate? Like, where should that be coming from?
Well, our funding is predominantly from the HSE, so that's who we link with. But in relation to buildings and premises and CAS funding, I'll let Dermot answer that. But in terms of the funding programme you talked about, it's reactive. So if there's a vacancy and there's somebody on the wait list, the clinical team, would engage and see does that individual suit that vacancy, and that a period of transition or assessment would commence. It's a long process. It's not like the acute sector, where one in and one out. It's a process. So the time can be quite lengthy in some cases.
But I suppose, though, at least we know as a committee now that you're expecting these numbers between now and 2028, so we have to make a lot of noise about that.
Yeah, and also, while there's vacancies in some of our residential houses, they may not be suitable for places at all going forward if they're on the first floor, and the majority of the people on the waiting list require ground floor accommodation, for example. A lot of the vacancies become null and void based on the current demand. Okay. But you want to answer the premises now?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose I might address the non-residential units very briefly first. I know you touched on both. In terms of day centres, St Michael's House have a 5-year properties plan, and we've invested heavily in our existing premises. There are a number of legacy issues there, and the HSE estates in CH09 have been extremely helpful to us and supportive of us. Huge challenges with the day centres in terms of trying to provide fit-for-purpose centres for the provision of day services, again, especially for people with higher support needs. That's integrated into the community. That's inclusive. It's moving out of the industrial estates and things like that into more areas. What we're finding is things like retail parks, business parks, they are not suitable for the provision of day centres. So it is extremely challenging from where we operate our services from. However, we have developed 4 ASD centres last year, and Deputy Ellis would have referred to that previously. We have another 8 new centres in the pipeline at the moment, and a further 6 of our existing centres that are being upgraded to provide additional capacity. But it is challenging in terms of trying to find fit for purpose. In terms of residential, to try and answer your questions, Are we going to match the requirements? No, I don't believe so. I don't think any service provider it is, and the main reason for that is it is just so difficult to find suitable accommodation for community housing. Independent living units, I would say, again, is challenging, but is easier. But to try and find community housing, especially again in the North Dublin area, we see an awful lot of high-density developments, high-rise apartment blocks, high-density housing estates. Community housing is very bespoke. It's a number of people living under the one roof that are supported by staff. It's quite a significant size building. It ideally needs to, follow the principles of universal design for housing or the IWA's best practice access guidelines, which are quite bespoke and quite different to your standard social housing model.
So with your crystal ball, bearing in mind that we might need 130 or whatever of those, 230 of those, or accommodation to meet the needs of 230 people, what percentage of that do you think we'll meet by 2028? Off the top of your head, do you think you'd be able to cater for 10 of those people, 50 of those people, 100 of those people?
We have a CAS application in at the moment for 2 houses in Ballymun, which could accommodate 6 people. A further CAS application in for 1 person in Donamead, there's 7. And the HSE are assisting us with a project in North Dublin, which will accommodate 6 people, that's 13. Those 3 projects are on the go about a year and a half, and we haven't started construction yet. So I think it's going to be a very small percentage. Okay,
thanks for that frank response. I appreciate it. And thanks for all the hard work that you're trying to do, I think, under very difficult circumstances. Sorry, then I just said human resources. Where can we put pressure to help? Respite, transport. Yeah. What happens to people when their parents die? Where do they end up?
So in relation to HR, I know the committee would have heard a lot from Section 39 agencies and the particular challenges there, but we have challenges ourselves. We're all recruiting the same people. The sheer numbers that we require are not there. We require increased places in university for specialist clinical staff. And we're working with the National Federation in terms of a campaign to promote disability as an attractive place or career path to work. That is a challenge. For example, in some of our areas where there are behaviours of concern, there's a risk to staff. Trying to get staff to work in those particular areas where there's very complex behaviours can be challenging. We've gone to the UK, we're continually recruiting, we're focusing on retention, but we're barely head above water at this stage, and employees are moving around and moving to different organisations. In relation to, is there a requirement to step up? You were asking about, do we have what we need? I think, it's evident that we don't have what we need. And I can talk about, what we do need is roughly in terms of right now, in terms of current sustainability, we're talking about almost a 10% uplift in HSE allocation. We need significant investment in ICT and transport, and I'll let Tara talk about transport. So, for example, ICT, for years and years, under investment, our systems and processes, very manual. Apart from that, even security, we require a €2 million investment to ICT and thereafter a €1 million spend. And the third thing in terms of what we need is we need that new services are funded in full. So what we cost as the actual cost of service delivery, which includes staffing, employers' PRSI, non-paid, clinical staff, transport, everything, that they're fully funded. And there isn't an expectation on us to take on new services without that full funding. So that's what we need, St Michael's House. In terms of, and also I would say in terms of, is there a need to step up? We would, we're a member of the National Federation, and with the Federation we would call for funding of the disability capacity, the Disability Action Plan, that continues and is fully funded over the years of the plan. In terms of respite is a significant issue. And, you saw that there is waiting list with St Michael's House there. There has been a move. Years ago, there would be respite with each service provider. So each service provider would have X amount of respite houses, typically residential respite and some alternative types of respite. But there has been a move, certainly in the CHO area that we operate in, and in some other CHO areas, a move away from respite per service provider to a more regional respite, so that those most in need or those on the priority get that respite. So when there's funding available for a new respite facility, everybody's asked to tender. So we have tendered in the past. We haven't won those tenders. Recently there was a tender which we didn't apply for, or we were ineligible for, because it wasn't focused on people with an intellectual disability. It was on disabilities in general. So we would then be expected to operate a facility that in theory wouldn't have service users or families receiving respite from St Michael's House. So that's kind of beyond kind of St Michael's House. In relation to what happens when elderly parents die, certainly it's reactive. So we would highlight on a monthly basis the risks, those at home who are at risk, and many times we try and do our best and plan for those occasions where people really need a residential place or whatever it may be. And sometimes it works when there's a vacancy, and other times it's an emergency situation. So it's a crisis, and it includes individuals going into the acute sector. It's appalling for the service users. It's appalling for the staff. Everybody's involved. The acute sector, obviously, they want their bed, and typically then we're costing the residential placement. And if we don't have a suitable vacancy, which many times is dependent on the appropriate environment, sometimes those individuals are placed with private providers. So there's no point me pretending to. Otherwise, sometimes we can accommodate. But more and more, and increasingly, I've been in this sector at an executive level for 20 years, and more, it's an emergency response. I have to say we work very well with the HSE. I'm not trying to throw them under a bus or anything. Everybody is doing their best. But that's the reality in terms of the emergency placements. You asked if PDS, you said that the CEO had stated PDS has failed. As CEO of St Michael's House, I haven't got that notification that the PDS has failed, and we are continuing, and we work locally with the HSE, and we're part of governance, and we're following the roadmap for PDS. So that's all I'm aware of. You asked if are we failing? Yeah, I mean, when I'm sitting in front, talking to parents, and they're asking me, what happens when I die, and I'm sitting and saying to them, I don't know, we'll do our best when the time comes. It certainly feels like a failure, but I can assure you that, we are doing our best, Yeah. So in terms of transport?
Yeah. Okay, so for transport, we don't offer transport per se to every service user that attends a day service in St Michael's House. So what we do is we look at the cohort who probably need it most. So we look at our wheelchair users, we look at people who cannot go independently on a bus to their day service or to use public transport. We've continued to offer that service. It is a national issue in transport because it's not funded, but we have continued to offer the service to these people. We currently have about 221 service users on 33 routes, so it's quite a lot of buses. We have outsourced the majority of that to a regulated third party. So it works quite well, but I think for these services you have to remember the bus is about a driver, but it's also about an escort, and it's about having the right people on that bus as well. So we would ensure they're trained. We meet them before they even start to drive for us or escort our service users. So it's quite a bespoke service. Like I said, it is unfunded. We have looked at the wait list, and I think if we were to offer, the current cohort plus the wait list, and we were outsourcing it, we'd be looking at about 3.5 million a year. So it significantly adds to our deficit every year. So it's an annual.
And what's the budget for what you do provide at the moment? could you say?
What do we spend currently at the moment? I would say anywhere between 2 and 2.5 million.
So, in other words, to meet the need, you'd need to double that.
I would need to increase the routes to about 37, and that's not even...
So that would probably explain the volume of correspondence I get.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And our own family experience of there just been no...
And we get multiple complaints in from families.
I'm going to finish now, Chair. I don't want to keep you any longer. I really appreciate your responses here and your candour. And it's just, during the financial crash, we got intellectual honesty from the banks to a certain extent, in that they put their hands up and said, we failed and we need help from outside the jurisdiction. And we handed our sovereignty over to the Troika in terms of financial and fiscal matters. And then we paid, the debt was socialised, and all of us and our children and our grandchildren bailed them out, despite the fact that my friends in media characterise it as them bailing us out. But we bailed them out. We're still paying. And I think part of the consequence of that is the lack of investment and funding that you're experiencing. And so in the same spirit of intellectual honesty, I think it behoves us, if we're approaching this from a rights-based approach, to accept that, I wouldn't say you have failed, but that the system is failing families because of the reasons that you've articulated here. And so there's no criticism of you. I wouldn't assign any blame to anybody in this room, but I think that, as a committee, I think it behoves us to really hammer home to government that what we've had for the last 10, 12 years is not good enough. That if we're going to, meet our commitments under the UNCRPD, and if Taoiseach Harris follows through on his promise to ratify all the protocols, if we're really to adopt a rights-based approach, we have to, like everything else, we have to pay for it. And if we're prepared to pay for bankers' debts, this is a very modest ask. So, look, thanks very much for your answers. And there's a huge volume of correspondence coming in about unmet need, whether it's things being cancelled at the last minute for children on an annual basis, that every year parents have to campaign to have services retained for them over periods of time. It's just, it's disheartening. But thanks very much for your evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So just to, I suppose, kind of finish up here. Obviously, we've heard from other organisations like yourselves, and some of them are Section 38, some of them Section 39, but the biggest issue is funding, and it's an annual funding. So, it should be moved, I presume you agree, to a multi-annual kind of, that you can plan ahead. The funding you get isn't actually sufficient to pay for everything that you provide. But, the HSE has to be aware of that. Why do they not increase funding to match need year on year? Or how do you bridge the gap? Because
I think it goes back to what I stated in terms of, there needs to be an agreement